Lieutenant Colonel Camille Harris, a black woman who had served the nation with honor and dedication for over 2 decades, had always been someone who avoided drawing attention to herself. Today, she was on a regular flight, dressed simply in a white shirt and black jeans. Her uniform was far from her body. Her presence, however, was powerful in a quiet way. She had earned every stripe, every position, but she didn't need to wear it on her sleeve. She was just Camille. The plane was already packed as she settled into her window seat, preparing to take a break from the demands of her high-profile role as a military advisor. The hum of the engine filled the air, and the gentle swaying of the plane made Camille relax. However, the curiosity of the passengers around her didn't go unnoticed. She'd seen the glances before, the subtle and not so subtle looks that came her way because of the color of her skin. Some eyes lingered longer than others, some with wonder, others with suspicion. She had learned long ago that it was something she would have to endure. What Camille didn't expect, however, was what happened. Next, as the plane ascended, a wealthy passenger seated in the row across from her seemed visibly uncomfortable. He shot a few looks in her direction, trying to hide his disdain, but it was evident. When a pair of police officers walked by, one of them leaned over, whispering something to the man. They laughed quietly among themselves, clearly unaware that Camille, sitting just a few seats away, could hear every word. "Why is she even here?" The man muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with disdain. Camille's gaze was steady, her mind racing. The officer's careless whispering and the man's attitude were a reminder of the racial bias she had faced her entire life, especially in a world that often expected black people, especially black women, to shrink in the face of disrespect. Without a word, she stood up, her posture strong and dignified. "Excuse me," she addressed the flight attendant, her voice calm but filled with authority. The attendant, a young woman, looked nervously between Camille and the officers, unsure of how to respond. But Camille's gaze was unwavering. "Please, inform these officers and this passenger that I am a lieutenant colonel in the military, and I have served this nation for over 20 years. The room went silent. The officers looked at each other, shifting uncomfortably in their seats as the wealthy man's face turned bright red. Just then, Camille's phone buzzed. She took it out, revealing a news article with her name and a photo from a recent military conference. The flight attendant, having gathered herself, looked from Camille to the officers and then back to the man. "We apologize, ma'am," the attendant said with sincerity, though the officers were still taken aback. The wealthy passenger, his eyes wide with embarrassment, stammered, I didn't realize—" "No," Camille interrupted, her voice clear and steady. "It's not just about what you didn't realize. It's about fairness. It's about respect." She sat back down in her seat, her demeanor calm, but there was an undeniable air of power about her now. As the flight continued, the officers avoided eye contact. The passenger remained silent, and the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to shift. The story of Camille Harris wasn't just one of military strength, it was one of self-respect, of standing up when it mattered, and a reminder that fairness could be found, even in the most unexpected places. In a world where many would have remained silent, Camille chose to stand tall, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt less than because of the color of their skin. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin, but after a while, Camille's peace was interrupted by a strange noise. She turned slightly to find a middle-aged man, well-dressed in an expensive suit and sporting a gleaming gold watch, settling into the seat next to hers. At first, Camille didn't think much of it, focusing on the view outside the window, allowing herself to enjoy the fleeting moments of quiet. But then the man began to clear his throat repeatedly, as if something about the situation was bothering him. It wasn't a mere cough. It was an exaggerated noise, a subtle yet deliberate attempt to draw attention to himself. Camille glanced at him, her patience wearing thin, but she kept her gaze steady outside. A few minutes later, his discomfort became even more evident. "Could you change seats?" he asked. his voice low, but carrying an unmistakable tone of demand. Camille turned to face him, her expression unreadable. She could feel the weight of his cold eyes upon her, a silent judgment hanging in the air. "Sorry, I don't quite understand. This seat is mine," she replied calmly, holding his gaze without flinching. The man frowned, his lips curling into a disapproving sneer. "I feel uncomfortable sitting next to you. Can you move to another seat?" There it was. The discomfort, the underlying racism veiled as a personal preference. Camille had faced this before. People too uncomfortable with her skin color, too eager to see her as something less than. Yet, she remained poised. She understood the complexity of people's biases, but that didn't mean she would let them dictate her actions. "I'm sorry, but I've chosen this seat, and I'm not moving," Camille said, her voice steady, though the sting of his words was palpable. The man's eyes narrowed, a sarcastic smile forming at the corners of his lips. "You can talk to the flight attendant. They'll definitely understand and help me," he added, his tone now dripping with disdain. Camille said nothing more, but inside, a sense of disbelief stirred. Why was this still happening? How could someone assume their discomfort should take precedence over her right to exist peacefully in her space? Moments later, the flight attendant arrived, her polite smile seemingly an automatic response. She approached the man, then looked at Camille, her eyes flicking nervously between the two. The man wasted no time. He raised his hand, pointing at Camille as if she were the cause of some great disturbance. "She's making me uncomfortable," he said, his words deliberately loud enough for others nearby to hear. "I asked her to move. This is a long flight. I can't sit next to someone like this." The flight attendant hesitated, her brows knitting together in confusion. She didn't want to create a scene or offend a paying passenger, but she also didn't want to cause conflict with Camille, who had remained composed through the entire exchange. The tension was thick, and it was clear to everyone around that this wasn't just about a seating preference. It was about something much deeper, something Camille could no longer ignore. "I apologize for the inconvenience," the flight attendant said, her voice unsure as she glanced at Camille, then back at the man. For a moment, it seemed as if the flight attendant might cave under the pressure, but Camille could feel a quiet strength growing within her. This wasn't just about her seat. It was about standing up for what was right. "I'm sorry," Camille said, her voice firm, not raising it, but allowing each word to carry the weight it deserved. "The issue here isn't me. It's the idea that your discomfort should be more important than my dignity." The room fell silent for a beat, and the flight attendant, now clearly caught in the middle, turned to the man. "Sir," she said softly, "I must ask that you respect the space of others, and please, let's all try to keep the peace for the duration of the flight." The wealthy man opened his mouth, about to protest further, but something in the attendant's voice, firm, authoritative, seemed to change his mind. He closed his mouth, his face reddening with frustration, but he said nothing more. Camille leaned back in her seat, maintaining her calm. She didn't need to engage in further confrontation. She had already made her point clear. The man next to her, now fuming in silence, avoided looking at her again. The flight continued in a tense but quiet atmosphere. Camille's presence, though, understated, had left an undeniable impression. Her story wasn't just about enduring discomfort, it was about standing firm, even when the world around her seemed to demand submission. In a society that often expected black people, especially black women, to remain silent in the face of prejudice, Camille had made it clear that she would never allow discrimination to pass unnoticed. Her strength lay not just in her military training or her accomplishments. It lay in her unyielding dignity, her refusal to be silenced by the unfairness of others. Camille's patience was wearing thin as the flight attendant repeated, "We can arrange for her to be moved elsewhere, if you feel uncomfortable." The suggestion struck Camille like a slap in the face. It was an option, yes, but one she would never accept. It was as if her right to be seated where she chose, her dignity as a person, was being questioned simply because of the color of her skin and the evident hostility from the man next to her. She had endured this before. Racial prejudice, subtle or blatant, woven into the fabric of everyday life. But today, Camille was not about to let it slide. Her silence in response to the attendant's offer was short-lived, and when she spoke, her voice was resolute. "I am not changing seats," Camille stated firmly, looking directly at the attendant, then at the man who had made the request. The flight attendant's expression tensed, her shoulders stiffening. She glanced at the man, nodding slightly as if to appease him, but said nothing further. Camille felt the weight of the situation pressing down, but she remained unshaken. The wealthy passenger, clearly unsatisfied, pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Camille didn't need to guess who he was calling. It was clear by the way he spoke that this man believed his influence would get him what he wanted. She had been in situations where power played a role, but Camille was no stranger to overcoming obstacles with grace. She refused to let him win this time. It wasn't long before 3 policemen boarded the plane. Camille knew instantly that this wasn't just about a seating dispute anymore. Something far darker was at play. One of the officers, a man who appeared to have years of experience, approached her. "Are you the one causing trouble on this flight?" he asked, his voice cold and authoritative. Camille's heart raced for a moment, but she kept her composure. "No," she replied evenly. "I was just sitting in my chair and did nothing wrong." The officer's frown deepened as he exchanged a glance with his colleagues. "There is a passenger requesting that you move your seat. If you do not comply, we will have to intervene," he said, his tone still devoid of empathy. Camille's heart constricted, but her resolve hardened. She refused to be intimidated. "I did nothing wrong. I have the same right to be here as any other passenger," she replied, her voice steady despite the growing tension. The officer's demeanor shifted quickly, and while one of them tried to speak gently, the other 2 began to show their true colors. They were dismissive, their words loaded with hostility. One of the officers raised his voice, shouting at Camille, "Who are you to refuse this passenger's request?" Camille could feel the rage building inside her, but she refused to let it control her. She had been here before. This was a fight she knew well. "I did nothing wrong," she replied firmly, holding her ground. "I didn't move." The tension in the air thickened, and the police officers closed in on her, their eyes no longer filled with neutrality, but with judgment. The passengers around them started to murmur, some of them realizing the unfairness of the situation. But most remained silent, unwilling to speak up. Camille could feel the eyes on her, some curious, others uncertain, but she refused to be silenced. As the officers' aggressive stances grew more apparent, Camille's sense of pride in herself only deepened. She had worked hard her entire life, never allowing the injustices she faced to break her spirit. Now, standing here, confronting not just one man but a system of power designed to push her down, Camille's heart swelled with courage. She knew this wasn't just about a seat. It was about her identity. It was about what she stood for: fairness, respect, and equality. It was about dismantling the racism she had fought against her whole life. With each passing moment, Camille realized that while the tension in the air was rising, so was her own strength. She would not back down. No one would push her around. No matter the pressure, the police officers, despite their attempts to intimidate her, realized they would not succeed. They surrounded her, their gaze cold, but Camille stood tall, unyielding. The murmurs from the passengers around her began to grow louder, some whispering in disbelief, others staring with wide eyes at the injustice unfolding before them. Still, no one spoke up, but Camille didn't need them to. This fight was hers. As the 2 more aggressive police officers continued to criticize and threaten Camille, the 3rd officer, the one who had seemed more neutral, finally seemed to sense the rising tension. His voice softened as he spoke, trying to ease the situation. "We don't need to make such a big deal out of it," he said, his eyes meeting Camille's. "You can move somewhere else. No need to make a big deal out of it. Despite the overwhelming sense that the odds were stacked against her, Camille held her ground. The injustice of the situation burned inside her, but she remained calm. She slowly rose from her chair, standing tall, and turned to face the officer who had spoken. "No," she said firmly, her voice clear and unshaken. "I will not move. I have done nothing wrong, and if I have to leave, I will not leave quietly. I have a right to sit here, and I will not give in to this discrimination." The officer, clearly not expecting such a response, looked taken aback for a moment. But his silence was short-lived, as the other two officers, hearing Camille's strong words, grew angrier. One of them stepped forward, extending his hand as if preparing to physically remove her. "You can either walk, or we'll drag you," he said, his voice dripping with threat. "You will leave immediately if you do not want us to act," the officer shouted, his voice filled with rage. Camille's gaze remained unwavering. She did not flinch, nor did she show any fear. She had faced much worse in her career, and this would not be the thing to break her. "I will not go," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "You can pull out your guns and threaten me, but I will not go." The cabin fell into a tense silence. The only sound was the low hum of the airplane and the heavy breathing of the police officers who stood facing Camille. The remaining officers, who had initially tried to keep calm, began to speak out in an attempt to regain control of the situation. "What are you guys doing? There's no need to use guns," one of the officers said, his voice desperate. "Put the guns away." But instead of calming the situation, the words only made the two angrier officers more determined. Camille felt the cruelty in their actions, but she knew that she could not back down. She stood firm, every fibre of her being rooted in the belief that what she was doing was right. Then, almost like a signal, something began to change. Camille could feel it in the air. A shift, a subtle but powerful change. A man seated nearby, who had been watching the entire situation unfold, reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He began to record everything. Camille realized that this wasn't just someone observing. It was someone taking action, someone standing with her, someone using the power of their voice to document the injustice happening before them. "What is she doing?" the man shouted, his voice clear and filled with conviction. "She didn't commit a crime." The words struck a chord in Camille's heart, and for the first time in what felt like hours, a small but unmistakable smile crept onto her face. She wasn't alone. She had never truly been alone. There were others, watching, who were willing to speak up, willing to stand beside her in this fight. The police officers paused, caught off guard by the growing chorus of voices from the surrounding passengers. The murmurs and whispers spread through the cabin, and more people began to speak out, some standing in solidarity, others simply voicing their disbelief at what was happening. Camille's heart swelled with a sense of hope. She was not just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever felt this kind of discrimination. She was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced, for every person who had been told they didn't belong. The police officers, realizing that this was no ordinary situation, fell silent. The tension in the air reached its peak, and for a brief moment, everyone seemed to hold their breath. Camille stood strong, her posture unwavering, her resolve unbroken. This moment, she knew, would be one of many in the ongoing fight against injustice. It was a small victory, perhaps, but a victory nonetheless. The fight was far from over, but this was a turning point, a moment when others began to realize that the status quo would no longer be accepted. The passengers, the police, and even the wealthy man who had started this whole mess now understood. Camille Harris would not be pushed aside. She would stand her ground, and in doing so, she would inspire others to do the same. As Camille stood tall, unshaken in the face of adversity. The tension around her only grew more palpable. The passengers who had been silent, unsure of how to respond, now began to murmur amongst themselves. A whisper floated through the cabin from the back, where one passenger, who had been filming the entire ordeal, turned to those around him. "Who is she?" the voice asked, filled with disbelief. "What did she do to deserve this treatment? What could she have possibly done to make those policemen act like this?" The question lingered in the air, and the sense of discomfort that had been growing in the cabin turned into something stronger: curiosity. The flight attendants, once nervous, now appeared to notice the shift in the mood. Passengers began to shift in their seats, eyes turning toward Camille, sensing that something about this situation was much more significant than the simple dispute over a seat. Despite the hostility from the two policemen, Camille did not falter. On the outside, her posture remained firm, steady, her gaze unflinching. Inside, however, the waves of injustice and insult still crashed against her, threatening to overwhelm her composure, but she refused to let the weight of it show. She was not just any woman. She was a soldier, and a soldier didn't back down in the face of adversity. She was stronger than ever, fueled by her pride as a military officer, her deep sense of duty, and her resolve to stand firm against what she knew was wrong. As the words sank in, the once hostile atmosphere had now turned into one of quiet reflection. The passengers, still reeling from what they had witnessed, began to process the reality of what had just happened. Here was a high-ranking military officer, a respected advisor to the nation, who had been publicly insulted and threatened by two racist policemen on a commercial flight. But now, with her identity revealed, Camille was no longer just a target. She was a symbol of resilience, dignity, and self-respect. The two policemen who had been most aggressive realized they had overstepped. One of them, visibly shaken, stepped back, pulling out his radio. "There has been a mistake," he muttered, his voice cracking with confusion and unease. "She is a high-ranking military officer. Apologies for the inconvenience." Camille listened to his words but wasn't satisfied. She had fought too hard, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been subjected to injustice and discrimination. She raised her voice steady and powerful as she addressed the officers one last time. "You need to take responsibility for your actions," she said firmly, her eyes locking onto theirs. "You have not only disgraced me, but you have also disgraced an institution and a country. Leave this place now." The room was deathly silent. No one spoke, but everyone was watching. Some passengers exchanged glances, while others seemed to process the weight of Camille's words. The officers, now aware of the magnitude of their actions, exchanged hesitant looks, realizing they had no choice but to step back. Just as Camille had made her stand, someone else in the cabin took action. A man who had been quietly recording the entire incident on his phone stood up and walked toward the police. "I filmed the whole thing," he said, his tone decisive and firm. "I'm going to post it on social media right away." His words were like a final push, leaving the officers speechless. The man's declaration, combined with Camille's powerful stance, sealed their fate. One of the policemen, pale and visibly rattled, turned to the others. "We apologize," he said quickly, his voice no longer full of the aggression it had once held. "We will leave the plane immediately." Without another word, the three officers quickly made their exit, their heads lowered in defeat. The passengers, who had been watching in tense silence, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief as the situation de-escalated. But even in this moment of quiet, some couldn't contain their thoughts. People began to whisper among themselves, sharing their shock and disbelief at what had just happened. Some passengers pulled out their phones, recording their own versions of the story, eager to spread the word. Within moments, videos and images from the flight were flooding social media. The incident had sparked something bigger, something that would not be easily ignored. The video quickly went viral, spreading across platforms and reaching millions of people. Comments flooded in, some filled with outrage, others with support for Camille's bravery. Her story became a rallying cry for those who had faced similar discrimination or injustice. It was more than just an isolated event. It was a call to action, a reminder that no one should ever be made to feel inferior because of the color of their skin, their background, or their appearance. As the plane began to steady itself once again, the passengers who had been witnesses to the conflict started to share the story, amplifying the message of resilience and justice. Camille sat back in her seat, exhausted but unbowed, knowing that her actions had made a difference. This wasn't just about a single incident. This was about a movement, one that would continue to gain momentum with every voice raised, every video shared, and every person who stood up and said, "This is not acceptable." The online community was enraged by the police officers' blatant racism, and the ripple effect was felt far beyond the flight. The video, now viral, quickly caught the attention of the city's mayor, a longtime friend of Camille. As soon as he saw the footage, he was deeply disturbed by the injustice that had occurred. He didn't hesitate in responding. The mayor called for an immediate investigation into the incident, making it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated in his city. True to his word, the investigation moved swiftly. Within days, both officers who had been most aggressive towards Camille were held accountable. They were fired from their positions. The news of their dismissal sent a strong message that racism would not be tolerated in law enforcement. Public outcry only grew stronger as the story spread. Numerous organizations, civil rights groups, and individuals condemned the actions of the officers, calling for systemic change within police forces nationwide. Camille had not only won a personal battle against racism, but she had also earned something far greater: respect. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. Messages of solidarity flooded in from all over the country, particularly from her military colleagues and others who had long admired her for her commitment to her country and the principles of justice. Many of her supporters pointed to her resilience during the incident as a symbol of strength, dignity, and the unwavering fight against inequality. Her image, standing tall and unyielding in the face of discrimination, became a beacon of hope for many. The mayor, who had been a close friend of Camille for years, didn't just stop at supporting her through the investigation. He knew this was the perfect opportunity to push for larger changes within the system. He took an active role in launching an advocacy campaign focused on police retraining and improving the attitudes of public officials. The mayor, alongside experts and influential figures, began working on a plan to address racism not just in policing, but also in public institutions more broadly. Realizing that the incident had sparked a much-needed conversation about racism in society, Camille didn't want to stop there. She had already faced so much during her career, but now she felt a stronger calling. She wanted to make sure that the system that had once wronged her would not continue to perpetuate these injustices. Camille decided to use her voice and platform for a larger purpose. She began participating in training programs, speaking out about the importance of diversity and inclusion, and working towards creating more positive changes in the military and beyond. Camille recognized that her journey wasn't just about personal victory, it was about contributing to a greater cause. She was determined to help build a more just society, and she knew that the fight was long, but it was worth every step. Meanwhile, the video from the plane incident continued to circulate on social media. It became part of a larger national conversation about racism and the abuse of power by those in authority. Discussions around systemic inequality and how to address it gained significant momentum. The video was shared by millions, igniting a public discourse about how racial discrimination often goes unnoticed or unchecked, especially when those in positions of power misuse their authority. This sparked more protests, more discussions, and more calls for action. But it wasn't just the criticism that stood out. For every person who condemned the actions of the officers, there were countless others who praised Camille's courage and strength. People from all walks of life began to reflect on their own biases and the importance of standing up against injustice. The overwhelming support, combined with the harsh criticism aimed at those responsible, created a powerful movement for change. The incident may have started with a single act of racism on a plane, but it quickly became a catalyst for something much bigger. Camille's bravery in the face of such adversity was the spark that ignited a fire that would not easily be extinguished. Her story became a symbol of what it means to stand up for justice, even when the odds seem stacked against you. And as the discussion continued to evolve, it was clear that Camille's fight was far from over. The video that began as a distressing moment had transformed into a powerful tool for advocacy and education. Camille was no longer just the woman who had stood up to racism on a plane. She was a force for change, one who would continue to inspire others to do the same. Despite overcoming the difficult and deeply painful ordeal, Camille never forgot the insults she had endured. The scars were not just physical, but emotional and psychological. However, this harrowing event ultimately transformed her into an even stronger individual. The lessons she learned in that moment were profound, and they shaped her perspective in ways she hadn't imagined. She came to understand that sometimes the actions of just one person could lead to monumental change. Camille's journey was not only about overcoming racial discrimination, but about using her experience to fight for something greater. She realized the power of her voice, her resilience, and her ability to inspire others. She had become a beacon of hope, a symbol of justice, and a living example of what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were insurmountable. Her story was no longer just about an unfortunate incident on a plane. It had grown into a movement. The ripple effect of her courage continued to inspire countless others who faced similar struggles. It reminded people everywhere that the fight for justice and equality was ongoing, and that each person could make a difference. Camille's legacy, as both a military officer and an advocate for justice, became a source of strength for all those who struggled against injustice. Her story resonated with individuals across the globe, especially those who had been marginalized, and it provided a reminder that standing up for what is right is always worth the fight. As the story continued to be shared and talked about, Camille became more than just a respected officer in the military. She had become a symbol of resilience, strength, and hope for everyone fighting against racism and inequality. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this powerful story. If you found it meaningful, don't forget to click, like, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story that will continue to inspire change.